On my left, from Airbus Americas is Tim Ganner, Vice President of Strategy and Corporate Development. Tim spent 28 years and change in the U.S. Air Force, leaving the Air Force as a colonel. He is a KC-135 and KC-10 pilot. And when we talk about the KC-135 and KC-10, there we go, that was operator error. What we're talking about is the current strategic aerial refueling capability that the Air Force has, the 135 on the left and the KC-10 you see on the right. Tim also commanded KC-135 squadron and operations groups and is a veteran of Operations Desert Storm, Operation Northern Watch, Operation Southern Watch. His full bio with a lot of important details that I'm leaving out of necessity of time is in the online press kit. And to Tim's left and to my north is my friend Max Rothman, who's Director of Business Development for Light and Medium Military Aircraft for Airbus Defence and Space Inc. in our office in Herndon. Max was, by the way, for those of you who are joining us from the UK or are former UK residents, was base commander of RAF Fairford and RAF Welford. Spent 23 years in the U.S. Air Force, accumulating 3,500 flight hours, and was not just a C-5 and KC-135 pilot, but also an instructor and an evaluator. And Max, likewise, is a veteran of Operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Operation Allied Force, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Operation Enduring Freedom, and probably one or two I left out. And finally, to his left is Larry Galogli. Larry joins us here today from Lockheed Martin Aeronautics. He is Director of Business Development for Air Mobility Programs and has a 30-plus year career in the U.S. Air Force and the Air National Guard. Larry has more than 6,000 hours in a C-130, which we don't list the C-130s as a strategic aerial refueling aircraft, but C-130s are used extensively in a more, I guess you would say, a tactical aerial refueling role by both the Air Force and the Marine Corps and the Navy. And Larry, likewise, he commanded the 143rd Airlift Wing, Strategic Airlift Wing, and is a veteran of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and Operation Enduring Freedom. So with that as the pedigree, let's get into what we're actually talking about when we talk aerial refueling. And to illustrate some of these different points, we're using examples from our friends at the Royal Australian Air Force who have done a great job of documenting their experiences with our aerial refueling platform, which is the A330-based MRTT. That stands for Multi-Role Tanker Transport. And we call it multi-role because, just as the name implies, it's capable of multiple different types of aerial refueling and simultaneously being used as a transport aircraft because it carries all of its fuel, both for its purposes and for aerial refueling, in its wings and fuselage tanks without impinging on the cabin that can be used for cargo or for passengers. So let's go ahead and watch a video from the MRTT that gives a pretty good overview of some different aerial refueling techniques.
To Baghdad, we met up with the F-18Ms of the US Navy carrier based in the Persian Gulf. From there, we met up with the Australian Wedgetail, where we passed 15,000 kilos worth of fuel to those guys today. And from there, we then met up with the US Marine Corps in the EA-6 Prowler. Rounding off the day today, we had the original two Hornets that came up the carrier. We finished off refueling them. The Link 16 is a great tool that we have available to us. Basically increases our situational awareness of other aircraft in the area, what's altitude, what direction they're heading, how much fuel they got on board, if they're cooperative. What I mean by that is if we've loaded them into our computer as a friend that we're going to be operating with, we like to know how much fuel they've got. So that's really important and it's really good for us as well. Yeah, one of the milestones happened just 2 days after Anzac Day. We passed 50 million pounds of fuel since our first operations here in October 14. All this was out west of Iraq, and then from here we're now tracking back to our home base.
And the RAAF owns 6 of our aircraft out of a total 35 delivered, and we have 60 orders total for the A330 MRTT to date. Across 12 different nations. They call theirs the KC-30A, but it's the same platform. So, Larry, before we get into some of the mechanics of how we do the aerial refueling, I was hoping you could talk a little from a mission planning standpoint about why the aerial refueling is so important to the U.S. Air Force in particular as compared to some other allies. What kind of missions and what sort of a role is it fulfilling strategically?
Well, certainly, and thank you very much for having me. Happy to be here today. I think the simplest way to describe the tanker mission, the tankers are the great facilitator. We have all these very impressive fighter fleets around the world, whether they be U.S. fleets with F-16s and F-35s and F-22s and everything else, or F-18s or CF-18s at Bagotville here. They very rarely fight in their backyard. So they have to, one, get to where they're going, and you might see that type of operation as you see on the screen, where the tanker is what we call dragging the fighters to their ultimate location where they will then operate within the theater. And then once they get to the theater, then we set up the gas stations in the sky so they don't have to transit all the way back to the base to refuel and get back into the fight. So it really does allow the fighters to perform their missions wherever they may be, as well as allowing the bigger aircraft like the C-5 that Max flew operate efficiently all the way around the world by extending its legs and refueling those aircraft on the longer strategic legs as well.
And when we talk about the Air Force and this future requirement, this is really what we derive that from. So the Secretary of the Air Force put out a statement back in September saying that there was a need for an additional 14 tanker squadrons above and beyond any current program of record in the current operational fleet. Larry, can you sort of offer a perspective on what is it that the Air Force is doing or intends to do that would require such a dramatic increase in aerial refueling capacity?
Well, when you look around the world and the global situation, we're often faced with what I call the tyranny of distance. And look at operating throughout Africa, let's say, or over in the Pacific theater, and how far those fighter aircraft actually have to go to be in areas where they would operate. We've developed war plans for executing operations in all those areas, but then you actually have to be able to execute those war plans. So when you do the math and how much gas those fighters are going to need and the areas they will going to have to operate over, that's where all that additional requirement comes from. And it is definitely a high demand environment.
And you were talking earlier about the role that aerial refueling plays in moving, for example, an entire unit, like an entire squadron on a deployment at sort of the early stages of that. What are the mechanics of that and the kinds of operations the Air Force is looking for there?
Well, as you brought up in your opening comments, when we look at the MRTT and the multi-role tanker transport, being able to operate as not just a tanker, but as a transport as well is very, very important, particularly on those initial deployments where a squadron is going to pack up everybody. They're going to take all their maintenance crews with them. They're going to take all their maintenance kit with them. And when you can put that on the tanker that is actually then dragging all the fighters over to that forward deployed location, you create a very, very efficient operation. So the tankers land, they have all the maintainers on board, all the equipment they need to set up an operation on board, and then the fighters just roll in naturally behind them. So it is a force multiplier for any operation.
Thank you. And when we were having those conversations back in December when the agreement was first announced, we were talking about different criteria that the U.S. Air Force had put out in an RFI that was released in June, looking for short-term commercial aerial refueling services, and they referenced in there boom refueling and hose and drogue refueling, and that also prompted some questions. So what I want to do is briefly take a look at the mechanics of boom refueling, and then I'm going to ask Max to expound on that a little, both as a refueling pilot and also a receiver pilot. Whoops.
KC-30 adds a valuable refuelling capability to the Air Task Group in this region, not only to our own forces but also to the coalition forces. The F-16 is the first fighter type to refuel at the boom in theatre, and we also refuel our own E-7 surveillance aircraft. The capability for the RAF KC-30 to refuel the F-16 adds another capability we can offer the coalition air forces to conduct a mission in Syria and Iraq.
One of the things you'll notice in these videos is sort of a recurring theme. These go back to about 2014 when A330, Airbus A330 multi-role tanker transports began refueling U.S. combat aircraft on combat missions, with those aircraft being operated by our allies such as the Royal Australian Air Force. I believe UAE and the UK were some of the early adopters as well that were refueling U.S. combat aircraft. In the U.S. inventory, the aircraft that have refueled and been certified to refuel on our tanker on the boom are the C-17, E-3 AWACS, the F-15, F-16, F-35A, F-22, and P-8. There are others that haven't been simply because the Air Force hasn't asked yet to have them to be certified. That's certainly a possibility. Max, talk a little bit about the boom refueling. What we saw there essentially was a controlled collision in the sky with a massive flying spear being stuck into the top of another airplane going how fast, conservatively speaking?
Yeah, well, before we talk about speed, don't ever use the C word, the collision. That's not a good word when we're talking about this. I will share with you that there's a warning in the KC-135 dash one. The dash one is the flight manual for the aircraft. At the very start of that book, it says, warning, flying to large aircraft in close vertical proximity is inherently dangerous. And that used to make me very nervous when I'd read that. And then it goes on to tell you exactly how to do that very thing in the manual, which was rather unique. But as you do that, the reason for the boom is to get lots of fuel passed quickly. The KC-135, very old technology, it came out in the late 1950s. And yes, we're still flying them today. They're about 395 or so still flying today, believe it or not. Those aircraft can pass about 6,800 pounds of fuel per minute. So it's still moving a lot of fuel through a tube for a larger aircraft in particular. Larry spoke a lot about moving the fighters, which is critically important. But don't forget, we're also moving bomber aircraft. We're moving heavier aircraft that are moving cargo for humanitarian aid, disaster relief, but also for other kinds of things. Anytime we're moving major movements of force, that force extension and what we call global reach in the United States Air Force, to reach across to other areas that are not the United States ultimately, to get those assets moved forward. That global reach with a tanker is critically important. As you might imagine, a lot of nations might not like to have a B-2 park in their neighborhood to refuel, en route to going and doing what a B-2 might be doing. So most B-2 sorties, for instance, take off from the United States, fly directly to their points of impact where they're going to drop their weaponry and fly home non-stop. Some of those round trips taking 48 hours or more, only enabled by air refueling. And they might do 6, 7, 8, 10 air refuelings en route. The boom that Jamie pointed out can pass lots of fuel, more even on the KC-10, from the KC-10, but 6,800 pounds per minute from even the older model KC-135. KC-46, again, a lot more fuel than that. So critically important to have the boom versus what you'll learn about the drogue as we talk about that here in just a minute. The boom is a flying mechanism, so you'll see wings on the end of that long sort of tube, the straw there that the fuel comes through. It literally is flown by that boom operator. In the KC-135, very old technology, that boom operator lays prone, literally in what they call the bathtub in the back of the aircraft, laying in the tail of the airplane, looking through a small window back there. It's very old technology, but very effective. Lays there looking out a small window that extends from the back of the aircraft, just like that. You'll see that's a perfect picture. He's laying, quite literally looking out the tail of the aircraft for the aircraft to come up from behind in a rendezvous. As you might imagine with a fighter, that flying boom can literally, once connected, fly that fighter aircraft around the sky, and does quite frequently. The fighter connects to the boom and is then just using the tanker as its horizon. Bigger aircraft, I used to fly the tanker, but then I went and flew C-5 as a receiver. The C-5 Once I'm connected to the boom in the C5, I can push the tanker around quite easily. And it used to be very unique to do that now and then, just for fun. And then when I went back after flying the C5 to be a tanker pilot, once again, I had a much greater, healthier respect for being a good tanker pilot than I did beforehand. It's a great learning experience to do both things. Suffice it to say, the boom, as Jamie requested the discussion to be about, the boom is for larger offloads to bigger aircraft, multiple fighters, that kind of thing, all at once.
And given the size of the C5, you were telling me it actually has a bow wave that as the tanker pilot, you need to be aware of and compensate.
Yeah, absolutely. In many cases, as the tanker crew up front, we wouldn't even know if the fighters were connected yet. We would have to have the boom operator tell us that they were in fact in contact. When the C5 was coming up, or a KC-10 that was refueling coming up behind us, believe me, you knew it was there, and you knew it was pushing you. As you might imagine, a massive C5 aircraft, or even a KC-10 aircraft coming up behind, and directly underneath the tail, which is where the elevator is, that does all of your north-south movements in an aircraft. As that aircraft comes up, the bow wave, the air, basically a big air cushion coming off the nose of that aircraft, pushes underneath the tail and literally is moving the elevator up and down. There's quite a bit of compensation there. There were times when, in turbulence or just poor pilot technique, guilty at times, that you would literally scare the pants off yourself and come up too quickly beneath the tanker and would have to do emergency breakaway procedures and get out of the way quickly to avoid running into one another. Flying two aircraft in close vertical proximity is inherently dangerous once again. So it is a dangerous maneuver. There is a lot of aerodynamic factors at play when you're flying two airplanes very close to one another. You are literally feet apart and you're moving at 500 miles an hour in so doing. So it's doable, it's exciting, it's thrilling, it's rather dangerous, but it's doable, and there's a lot of aerodynamic forces at play.
So let's go back and take a quick look at hose and drogue refueling. We saw in the opening video some of that boom, and then we saw U.S. combat receivers such as the FA-18 E&F Super Hornets. I think in the earlier video we saw maybe an EA-18G or an EA-6B. Let's go ahead and Annabelle watch this kind of focus in on the hose and drogue refueling, and then Tim will ask you to explain a little bit about it. Oops. Here we go.
The KC-30A has been contributing to coalition operations in the projection of air power and in efforts to defeat and degrade Daesh here in the area of operations. We refuel most coalition aircraft on just about every other day, and as part of that, our unique way of operating has given us a reputation of flexibility, reliability and innovation. The biggest challenges of working in this environment is the environment itself. So it's hot, it's sandy, we're operating basically 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on a very small footprint. So accordingly, the guys are out on the flight line having to think about ways to keep themselves cool and to still be able to maintain the aircraft. And in the air, we're often flying reverse circadian rhythms, etc. So managing fatigue is a key challenge. But thankfully, Australians are very resilient, and we're also quite clever in the way we go about things, and accordingly we're getting the job done. The most satisfying aspect of operating the KC-30A in theatre is the coalition environment, the fact we're working as part of a bigger team, but furthermore the fact that the aircraft has been able to have nearly 100% serviceability rate, and that's not just due to the operators, it's due to the whole support network of the Air Task Group. Being here with the KC-30A is tremendously fulfilling both personally and as a group. We're refueling most coalition aircraft and we're helping to defeat Daesh, and it's making a real difference on the ground, and that's something we're very proud of.
So, Tim, explain a little bit about the dynamics of the hose and drogue refueling, primarily from the standpoint of the enabling technology, the pods, and also the fuselage refueling option.
Sure. Whereas the lineage of the boom system goes back to strategic bombers as far back as the KB-29 in the late 40s, early 50s, to refuel large bomber aircraft primarily, large offloads, high offload rates. The lineage of the pod system really is carrier-based aviation, where aircraft would take off with self-contained pods that could be mounted on the wings and and then taken off after the flight. But to take off and put a nominal amount of fuel in the air for typically an evolution when fighters would recover, the carrier-based aircraft would recover. So the requirements for offload weren't great, and they certainly didn't need high offload rates. 2,500 pounds typically offload for an evolution. So that's the way that the Navy and the coalition forces developed their capability, and when we tried to have that capability for boom-equipped aircraft, the logical thing was to put that same pod-based system on the wing of a tanker and use the same technology, basically. In addition, when I flew the KC-10s, we had a centerline system that was mounted on the aircraft at all times. In other words, it didn't need to be added to the wing. It was inherent to the aircraft, and it was always there. So on a given mission, you could pull the pod out, or you could run the drogue out, and then bring it back in, and then use the boom later in the flight if you needed to. So you had the capability on the same flight to refuel either naval-type aircraft or Air Force-type aircraft. The difference on the two systems you might have seen in the video, whereas with the boom-equipped system, the receiver comes to the contact position, and the boom operator plugs the receiver. With the drogue system, the pod is reeled out and it's stabilized at a fixed distance, and the receiver pod plugs it and gets the offload. So both systems are important. As you saw on the MRTT, they have a centerline system as well as wing pods as an option. So you can buy the centerline system, you can buy the pod system, you can get all three of them if you like. So it's kind of a capability that
Active versus passive.
right.
And one of the key sort of competitive discriminators that we've always positioned with our A330 tanker is the stability of that hose and drogue. So as the receiver is flying at that basket, essentially trying to put the probe in, the amount of movement that's inherent to that basket as it oscillates on the end of the hose. Can you talk a little bit about what controls the dynamics of that and what can cause movement of those baskets?
Sure, and that's specific to the wing-mounted system. Obviously, a wing-mounted system is affected by the wingtip vortices. So when you have a pod mounted to a wing, you're going to have some aerodynamic issues. All receiver aircraft have, all tanker aircraft that have carried wing pods have to deal with that interaction between the pod and the aerodynamics coming off the wing. The further out you put that pod, generally speaking, the more you're going to be influenced by the aerodynamics, the vortices. The interesting thing about the MRTT was the wing on the A330 is similar to it's very common with the wing on the A340. Recall the A340 was our 4-engine aircraft that preceded the A330. So when we decided to make our aircraft into a tanker, we noted that we could use the structure inherent on the A330 wing, which was designed for the A340, which also had the plumbing for that engine originally mounted there, which included electrics, hydraulics, pneumatics, etc., and put that pod on a very stable part of the wing, a relatively great distance from the tip, so it wasn't as influenced by the wingtip vortices. Plus, you had a winglet there that helped with the vortices issue. And you had a very stable pod system. In fact, it's quite an elegant design. So you have a structure, you have stability, you have the plumbing already in the system, so that it's a very elegant design.
And in your careers, have you ever known of receiver aircraft to be struck by an oscillating basket? I know when I was at NAVAIR, we had that issue a couple of times.
Yeah. So depending on